"Don't," Kristen whispered. She wasn't talking to the bride, or the groom. She was looking at the 80-year-old man who had just pushed his chair away from the reception table. Mr. Henry gave her the smallest shake of his head, almost apologetic, then reached for the microphone anyway. The room barely noticed. People were still laughing. Glasses were clinking. Someone near the dance floor was asking the DJ for another song. Mike smiled politely, expecting another sentimental wedding toast. Lauren slipped her fingers through his without thinking. Then Mr. Henry looked around the room and quietly said, "I've listened to people tell the wrong story about these three for 5 years. Before I congratulate anyone today, I think it's time they heard the one they missed." The laughter died one conversation at a time. Nobody moved. Mike's smile faded before he seemed to realize it. Lauren slowly let go of his hand. Kristen closed her eyes for just a second, like she'd been hoping this day would end without anyone reopening a wound she'd spent years learning to live with. What happened next didn't expose an affair. It exposed something much harder to admit, because everyone in Maple Ridge thought they knew why one marriage ended. The truth was, almost every single one of them had been watching it fall apart for years, and none of them recognized it while it was happening. Before I tell you how it all began, let me take a brief pause. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. If you had asked almost anyone in Maple Ridge, North Carolina, whose marriage would last forever, Mike and Kristen would have been the first names out of their mouth. Not because they were the couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other. They weren't the ones posting anniversary tributes every other week, or making everyone else uncomfortable with public displays of affection. They were something people trusted even more: predictable, steady, comfortable. Looking back, I think that's why so many people, including Mike and Kristen themselves, missed the warning signs when they finally appeared. They met at a community fundraiser a few months after Kristen moved back home from college. She had earned a degree in fine arts and couldn't stop talking about an idea she'd carried since she was 19. She wanted to create a place where children could paint, learn music, and discover creativity, especially the ones whose parents couldn't afford expensive classes. Mike liked listening to her talk about it. Not because he knew anything about art. He didn't. But whenever she described that dream, her whole face changed. She spoke with the kind of excitement people usually lose after adulthood starts asking them to be practical. Mike had just accepted his first coaching job at Maple Ridge High School. Football wasn't simply a sport there. Friday nights pulled half the town into the stadium. Wins were celebrated at church on Sunday. Losses somehow found their way into conversations at the grocery store. Coaching wasn't just employment. It became part of your identity. Their relationship never felt dramatic. It grew through ordinary days. Saturday mornings buying groceries together because neither of them wanted to shop alone. Late-night burgers after football games when every decent restaurant had already closed. Long drives through country roads where the radio stayed low enough that silence never felt uncomfortable. Kristen painted while Mike watched game film in the same room. Sometimes neither of them spoke for an hour. Neither thought they needed to. There was something comforting about simply sharing space. When they married, they rented a modest little house with aging hardwood floors that creaked every time someone walked through the hallway. The kitchen was too small. The bathroom faucet leaked every few weeks. The air conditioner seemed to quit whenever summer reached its hottest week. They laughed through most of it. Money was tight. Mike's coaching salary covered the basics, but promotions always seemed one good season away. Kristen found a full-time administrative position with a local nonprofit. "It'll only be for a while," she told Mike one evening while packing away another box of paint supplies. He looked up from balancing the checkbook. "You don't have to give that up." "I'm not giving it up," she said with an easy smile. "I'm giving us some breathing room." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "When things settle down, I'll have plenty of time." Neither of them questioned it. They genuinely believed they were making temporary sacrifices for the same future. Years have a strange way of changing the meaning of the word temporary. 1 year became 2. 2 quietly became 5. The boxes holding Kristen's canvases stayed in the same closet. Every now and then she'd open the door looking for holiday decorations. pause for a second, brush a little dust from the top box, then close it again. There was always another bill to pay, another football season, another opportunity that seemed more important. She stopped introducing herself as an artist. Without realizing it, she started introducing herself as Mike's wife, and Mike never asked whether that change hurt, not because he didn't care, because he assumed she would tell him if it did. She assumed he already knew. Neither assumption felt dangerous at the time. They still laughed together, still sat on the porch after dinner, still reached for each other's hand without thinking whenever they crossed a busy parking lot. From the outside, nothing looked different, and maybe that was the problem. Sometimes love doesn't disappear because two people stop caring about each other. Sometimes it slowly gets buried beneath the life they're trying so hard to build, while both of them keep believing they'll make time for each other once everything finally settles down. Football seasons came and went, but each one seemed to leave Mike carrying a little more responsibility than the last. A winning record brought expectations. A championship run brought attention. Soon, coaching wasn't something he did. It became the rhythm around which the rest of his life revolved. Practice started earlier. Film sessions ran later. There were booster club dinners, fundraising events, parents who wanted extra meetings, and players who needed guidance long after the final whistle. Kristen told herself it was temporary. She'd said that before, so had Mike. At home, their routines adjusted without either of them talking about it. Kristen handled the bills because Mike usually came home too late. She remembered birthdays for both families, mailed Christmas cards, scheduled dentist appointments, renewed insurance policies, and kept a running grocery list on the refrigerator. When Mike's mother needed knee surgery, Kristen drove her to every appointment without being asked. Mike thanked her every time. He meant it, but gratitude spoken in passing wasn't the same as sharing the weight. One Tuesday evening, Kristen set 2 plates on the table just as Mike called. "I'm sorry," he said. "Film review went long. Don't wait for me." She looked at the food she'd spent an hour cooking. "It's okay. I'll make it up to you." "I know." She wrapped his dinner and placed it in the refrigerator. By the time he got home, she was asleep. The next morning, neither of them mentioned it. That became their pattern, not because they were avoiding each other, because there always seemed to be a better time to talk. "If we can just get through this season. If things slow down after playoffs. Let's not ruin tonight." Conversations kept getting postponed. So did the feelings underneath them. Their 5th wedding anniversary arrived during football camp. Mike remembered it halfway through practice. He immediately called, "I'm the worst husband alive." Kristen laughed. "I was wondering how long it'd take." "I've already made reservations for Saturday." "I can't do Saturday. Your parents are coming over, remember?" There was a pause. "Oh, right. We'll celebrate another day." "We will." Neither sounded angry. Neither hung up upset. But after the call ended, Kristen stood in the office break room staring at her phone a little longer than usual. She couldn't remember the last time they celebrated something on the day it actually happened. That evening, she found one of her old sketchbooks while cleaning a closet. She sat on the living room floor and flipped through page after page of unfinished drawings. Mike walked in almost an hour later, exhausted. "You found those?" She smiled. "I forgot how much I used to draw." He loosened his tie and looked over her shoulder. "You're still amazing." "You think so?" "I know so. You haven't seen me paint in years." "I've seen enough." It was exactly the kind thing to say, and somehow it landed a little differently than he'd intended. She closed the sketchbook. "I should start dinner." "You don't have to. It's already late." The conversation drifted away before either of them realized there had been something important sitting between them. The little moments kept piling up. Mike would reach for her hand while walking into church, and she'd take it automatically. She'd leave encouraging notes in his lunch bag before big games. He'd bring her favorite coffee home on Saturday mornings. The affection never disappeared. It simply became routine, like locking the front door before bed. Comfortable, predictable, almost automatic. The harder conversations kept waiting for a day that never seemed to arrive. Friends still admired their marriage. "They've got it figured out," people would say. Neither Mike nor Kristen corrected them. Not because they were pretending, because they honestly believed every marriage went through seasons like this. One rainy evening, Kristen looked up from paying bills and noticed Mike asleep on the couch with game film still playing on the television. She reached over, turned the volume down, and covered him with a blanket. For a moment, she simply watched him. He looked tired, older than he had a year ago. She wanted to wake him and ask if they were still okay. Instead, she kissed his forehead, switched off the television, and walked upstairs alone. It felt like an act of love. Looking back, it was also another conversation they didn't have, and neither of them could see that every silence, no matter how gentle, was quietly creating room for someone else to be the person they talked to instead. Lauren had been part of Kristen's life for so long that nobody could remember exactly when she became family. They met in middle school after being paired together for a history project. Somehow that project turned into sleepovers, birthdays, college applications, and every milestone in between. When Kristen married Mike, Lauren joked that she deserved a permanent seat at every Thanksgiving. Nobody disagreed. She had a way of making people feel comfortable without trying too hard. She remembered names. She noticed when someone looked overwhelmed, and she had a habit of listening all the way to the end before offering an opinion. Kristen loved that about her. Mike respected it. As Mike's coaching responsibilities grew, Lauren started volunteering more often with the Football Booster Club. She organized silent auctions, helped decorate banquet halls, and somehow always stayed behind after events to fold tablecloths or stack chairs. "If Lauren ever charges us for all this free labor," Mike joked one evening, "the athletic department will go bankrupt." Kristen laughed. She'd probably accept payment in pizza. Those evenings felt ordinary. Kristen usually stayed inside finishing paperwork, while Mike and Lauren cleaned up outside with the other volunteers. Sometimes they talked about football, sometimes about town gossip, sometimes about nothing important at all. One evening, Mike sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck outside the community center, rubbing the back of his neck after another long fundraiser. Lauren handed him a bottle of water. "You look exhausted." "I feel exhausted." "You should take a weekend off." He laughed. "Tell that to the parents who think football never sleeps." She smiled but didn't push. After a moment she asked, "How's Kristen doing?" He shrugged. "Busy." "Busy good or busy worried?" "I don't know anymore." Lauren studied him for a second. "Have you asked her?" Mike looked down at the bottle in his hands. "Not really." "You probably should." "I know." That could have been the end of it. Maybe it should have been. But conversations like that kept happening. Never inappropriate. Never flirtatious. Just available. On days when practice ended badly, Lauren happened to be around helping prepare for another fundraiser. If Mike looked frustrated, she'd ask how things were going. She listened. Sometimes she defended Kristen. "She's carrying a lot too, Mike." Other times she challenged him. "You can't expect her to read your mind." Once, after hearing him complain that home felt quiet lately, Lauren smiled gently and said, "Maybe she's waiting for you to start the conversation." He nodded. "I've thought about that." "So what stops you?" Mike opened his mouth, then closed it. "I honestly don't know." Lauren never encouraged him to leave his marriage. If anything, she kept steering him back toward it. "Talk to her. Don't let this become normal. You two have been through too much to drift apart now." She meant every word, but neither of them noticed something changing beneath those conversations. Mike stopped wondering whether Lauren would understand. He assumed she would. That quiet certainty became its own kind of comfort. Meanwhile, Kristen never questioned their friendship. Why would she? Lauren was the person she trusted most outside her marriage. If Mike mentioned another late fundraiser, Kristen would often say, "Good, Lauren will probably be there. Tell her I miss her." She meant it. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them spent hours setting up tables for the annual athletic scholarship banquet. They laughed, shared sandwiches, teased each other about whose folding skills were the worst. From the outside, they looked exactly like three close friends working toward the same cause. No one would have guessed that invisible lines were already beginning to blur. Not because anyone crossed them intentionally, because emotional boundaries rarely disappear all at once. They move a few inches at a time. The banquet itself was a success. After the last guests left, Volunteers slowly headed home until only Mike and Lauren remained, stacking the final chairs beneath the dim lights of the gymnasium. "You should go," Lauren said. "Kristen's probably waiting." Mike checked his phone. No missed calls. No messages. "She's probably asleep already." Lauren didn't answer. They finished loading the last cart and ended up talking beside the parking lot for what felt like a few minutes. About football, about aging parents, about how strange it was that high school students they once coached were now bringing their own children to community events. When Mike finally climbed into his truck, he glanced at the dashboard clock. 2 hours had passed. He sat there with his hands resting on the steering wheel. A thought came so suddenly that it made him uncomfortable. He couldn't remember the last uninterrupted conversation he'd had with Kristen that lasted half that long. He stared through the windshield for another moment. His first instinct was to drive home and tell her. To ask if they could start talking again before whatever was happening became something they couldn't fix. Instead, he started the engine. By the time he reached home, he'd convinced himself it wasn't worth bringing up. Some thoughts feel safer when they're left alone. He didn't know it then, but that decision would become one of the quietest and most expensive mistakes of his life. By the following spring, nothing about Mike and Kristen's marriage looked broken from the outside. They still attended church together, still hosted Thanksgiving, still smiled for pictures at football banquets. If someone had watched them for an hour, they probably would have called them a happy couple. The problem was that nobody lived inside the hours between those moments. Kristen filled them with work. She arrived early at the nonprofit office, stayed late when someone needed help, then came home to laundry, groceries, and everything else waiting for her. She told herself she was making Mike's life easier. If he came home tired, the least she could do was make sure home felt peaceful. Mike noticed everything she did. He noticed the clean kitchen, the packed lunches, the fresh towels folded in the bathroom. What he didn't notice was that Kristen had stopped asking him about his day. Not because she didn't care, because she already assumed the answer. Busy. That one word eventually replaced entire conversations. Mike wasn't doing much better. After difficult practices or disappointing games, he'd sit in his truck for 5 or 10 minutes before going inside. Sometimes he stared through the windshield. Sometimes he scrolled through old photos on his phone without realizing it. By the time he opened the front door, he'd already decided not to bring his frustrations into the house. Kristen mistook his silence for exhaustion. Mike mistook hers for distance. Neither assumption was true. One evening, Kristen found an email she'd almost forgotten about. A regional arts organization was accepting applications for a grant to reopen community art programs. 5 years earlier, she would have started filling out the paperwork before finishing the email. This time she read it once, then deleted it. Mike walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. "Everything okay?" She forced a small smile. "Yeah, just cleaning out my inbox." He nodded and poured himself a glass of water. Neither of them knew an important decision had just been made. Around the same time, Lauren became the person Mike talked to without planning to. It happened after meetings, during volunteer projects, walking to the parking lot. There was never a reason to hide those conversations because there wasn't anything inappropriate about them. Lauren still asked the same question almost every time. "Have you talked to Kristen?" Mike always answered the same way. "Not yet." She'd sigh. "You need to." "I know." He meant it every single time. The problem wasn't honesty. It was delay. At home, Kristen noticed Lauren had been unusually busy helping with football events. "I'm glad she's around," Kristen said one night while folding laundry. "You've got someone keeping all those booster club parents organized." Mike smiled. "She's been a huge help." Kristen laughed. "Tell her she still owes me lunch." "I will." It never crossed her mind to wonder whether those two had been talking more than she and Mike had. Why would it? Trust had never been the problem. Loneliness had. The conversation happened on an ordinary Tuesday. No anniversary, no holiday, no argument leading up to it. Mike came home earlier than usual. Kristen was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills. She looked up and smiled. "You're home early. Can we talk?" Something in the way he said it made her set the pen down without another word. He sat across from her. For several seconds, he rubbed his palms together like he was trying to warm them. I've been trying to figure out how to say this. She waited. I don't know if I'm still in love. The sentence landed softly. That somehow made it worse. Kristen didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stared at him. Not with anger, with confusion, as if she were trying to understand a language she'd spoken her whole life that suddenly sounded unfamiliar. Mike looked down. I don't know when it happened. She swallowed, then asked the only question that came to her. When did you stop talking to me? Mike lifted his eyes. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He searched for an answer because he wanted one as much as she did. A fight, a mistake, a single turning point, anything. Instead, he found years of postponed conversations, missed chances, busy schedules, assumptions. He whispered, I don't know. Kristen leaned back in her chair. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was full of two people realizing they had somehow arrived somewhere neither of them had intended to go. After a long pause, she asked, Is there someone else? Mike didn't answer immediately. I've become close to Lauren. The words hurt, not because they confirmed an affair, because they explained everything she hadn't been able to explain to herself. You love her? I don't know. You talked to her? Yes. And you stopped talking to me. Mike lowered his head. There wasn't much left to deny. Neither of them accused the other of being a bad person. Neither reached for old arguments. They had run out of blame before they'd found understanding. For the first time in years, they were finally honest. It simply came too late. The divorce moved through the courthouse faster than the marriage had unraveled. Paperwork replaced conversations. Signatures replaced promises. When it became public that Mike and Lauren were planning a future together, Maple Ridge did what small towns often do. It filled the empty spaces with certainty. At church, people lowered their voices when Kristen walked by. At the grocery store, conversations stopped for a moment before starting again. Some insisted Mike had betrayed his wife long before he admitted it. Others argued people couldn't help who they loved. Very few admitted they didn't know what had happened inside that house. Lauren suddenly found herself carrying a reputation she had never wanted. Some friends stopped calling. A few parents avoided speaking to her at community events. She accepted it without defending herself. Every explanation sounded like an excuse before it was even spoken. Mike tried focusing on football. Winning games was easier than answering questions that didn't have simple answers. Kristen surprised everyone. She never argued with rumors. She never corrected gossip. When coworkers asked if she wanted to tell her side, she smiled politely. No, but people are saying things that aren't true. I know. Doesn't that bother you? She looked out the office window for a moment. It used to. A few weeks later, she walked through the worn front doors of the nearly forgotten Maple Ridge Community Arts Center. The building smelled faintly of old paint and dust. Several classrooms sat empty. The walls needed work. The budget was small. Most people saw an abandoned community project. Kristen saw something she hadn't seen in years, a piece of herself waiting where she'd left it. She accepted the position without hesitation. On her first afternoon, a little girl wandered into the art room, looked around at the empty easels and asked, Are we going to make this place pretty again? Kristen smiled. I think that's exactly what we're going to do. She was talking about the building, though she wouldn't realize it until much later. She was talking about herself, too. The first few weeks at the Maple Ridge Community Arts Center felt less like starting a new job and more like walking back into a life she'd left waiting. The building wasn't impressive. Several classrooms needed repairs. Shelves were missing supplies. The roof leaked whenever it rained hard enough. None of that bothered Kristen. For the first time in years, she ended each day thinking about colors instead of schedules. The first class only had 6 children. One couldn't stop talking. Another refused to pick up a paintbrush because he insisted he wasn't good at art. Kristen knelt beside him and slid a blank sheet of paper across the table. You don't have to make something beautiful. He looked up. What do I make then? Something honest. He frowned for a second. Then he started drawing. By the end of the month, there weren't enough chairs. Parents stayed after class asking how they could help. A retired watercolor artist offered to volunteer on Tuesdays. A local hardware store donated paint. Little by little, the building became louder, not with noise, with life. Kristen still had difficult evenings. She'd drive home, unlock the front door of her smaller apartment, and catch herself reaching for a light switch that wasn't there. Sometimes, she'd almost text Mike after hearing good news. Then she'd remember. She'd put the phone back down. The habit faded slowly. One Saturday afternoon, she opened the same box of art supplies she'd packed away years earlier. The brushes were stiff. Some paint tubes had dried out completely. She smiled anyway. Instead of mourning the years she'd lost, she picked up a fresh canvas. She painted until sunset. No audience, no deadline, no permission needed. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to hold a marriage together. She was simply becoming herself again, and somehow that felt both unfamiliar and wonderfully familiar at the same time. Mike and Lauren eventually stopped pretending their relationship was only friendship. There wasn't one dramatic conversation, no grand declaration. One evening after dinner, Mike reached across the table and took her hand. Neither of them pulled away. It felt honest. It also felt heavier than either expected. Dating inside Maple Ridge wasn't simple. People watched. At restaurants, conversations lowered as they walked past. Some smiled politely. Others didn't smile at all. Lauren handled it better in public than she did in private. One night, she stood in Mike's kitchen washing dishes after dinner. Without turning around, she asked, "Do you ever wonder if we should have waited longer?" Mike leaned against the counter. "Every day." She dried her hands and looked at him. "I love being with you." "I know, but sometimes I wonder whether people will ever believe we didn't plan this." Mike didn't answer, because he wondered the same thing. He cared about Lauren. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that happiness didn't erase what had happened before it. They carried that history into every ordinary moment. Lauren found herself hesitating before attending community events. Mike noticed old friends avoiding eye contact. Neither complained much. There wasn't much point. One evening, Lauren said softly, "I keep thinking about Kristen." Mike looked down. "So do I." Not because he wanted his marriage back, because he wished it hadn't ended the way it had. Love had brought them together. Regret had followed them there. Both learned that two things could exist at the same time, and accepting one didn't erase the other. By the end of the year, Maple Ridge had settled on a version of the story everyone seemed comfortable repeating. Kristen became the faithful wife who'd been left behind. Mike became the coach who chased someone new. Lauren became the best friend who betrayed another woman. The story was simple. Simple stories spread quickly. The truth never does. Mr. Henry heard those conversations everywhere. At church breakfasts, at the barber shop, outside football games. People spoke with complete confidence about moments they had never witnessed. He rarely interrupted. Instead, he'd listen until someone asked, "You knew all of them, didn't you?" He'd smile politely. "I did." "So, whose fault was it?" Mr. Henry always gave the same answer. If only it were that simple. Most people laughed. Some looked disappointed. They wanted certainty. He couldn't give them that, because he'd watched Mike and Kristen grow from teenagers into adults. He'd watched Lauren become part of their family long before anyone imagined things would end this way. He remembered birthdays, volunteer projects, hospital visits, conversations no one else had heard. He knew there wasn't one villain. There were three imperfect people who'd made small decisions that slowly became life-changing ones. He often wondered whether anyone would ever want to hear that version. Months later, Mike and Lauren announced their engagement. Some people congratulated them warmly. Others questioned the timing. The invitations went out quietly. One envelope found its way to Kristen's apartment. She stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a simple invitation. No long note, no explanation, only the date, the time, the location. She set it on the kitchen table and walked away without deciding whether she'd attend. Across town, Mr. Henry received his invitation too. He slipped it back into the envelope, rested it on his desk, and looked out the window. For the first time, he had the feeling that this wedding wasn't going to mark the end of a story. It was going to force everyone to finally hear the one they'd been telling wrong all along. Kristen almost didn't go. The invitation sat on her kitchen counter for nearly 3 weeks. Every time she passed it, she'd tell herself she'd decide tomorrow. Tomorrow eventually became the morning of the wedding. She stood in front of her closet longer than she expected, not because she wanted to impress anyone. She simply didn't want to arrive looking like someone who had come to make a statement. She chose a simple navy blue dress, tied her hair back, and drove herself to the church. By the time she reached the parking lot, guests were already filing inside. For a moment, she stayed in the driver's seat with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Then she took a slow breath, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance. Conversation softened as she passed. Not enough to be obvious, enough to notice. A few people smiled warmly. Others looked away too quickly. One older woman reached over and squeezed Kristen's hand without saying a word. That meant more than any speech could have. Kristen found a seat near the back, far enough away that she wouldn't become part of the ceremony, close enough to honor the invitation she'd chosen to accept. When the music began, everyone stood. Mike looked calmer than Kristen expected. Lauren looked beautiful, though there was something careful about her smile. As Mike turned toward the aisle, his eyes swept across the room. For the briefest moment, they landed on Kristen. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. Then the ceremony continued. Lauren noticed. She didn't react. She simply slipped her hand into Mike's as the officiant began speaking. The vows were sincere. No one doubted that. Yet beneath the celebration sat a strange awareness that everyone in the room carried a different version of the same story. No one said it aloud. They didn't have to. It lingered there between every polite smile and every round of applause. When the ceremony ended, people gathered for the reception, believing the hardest part of the day was finally over. None of them realized it hadn't even begun. The reception settled into the familiar rhythm of weddings. Servers carried plates from table to table. Someone laughed too loudly near the dance floor. Children chased each other between chairs until their parents called them back. Then Mr. Henry slowly stood. Most guests smiled. Everyone assumed another heartfelt toast was coming. He accepted the microphone, waited until the room quieted, and looked first at Mike, then Lauren, then Kristen. "I've known these three almost their entire lives," he began. "So before I congratulate the newlyweds, I'd like to share something." His voice stayed calm. "There are stories we tell because they're simple." He paused. "And there are stories that are true." The room became noticeably still. I watched Kristen postpone her own dreams because she believed she was helping build someone else's. Kristen lowered her eyes. I watched Mike carry pressures he didn't know how to explain without feeling like he was complaining. Mike stared at the table. And I watched Lauren spend years trying to help two people she genuinely loved find their way back to each other. Lauren's fingers tightened around her napkin. Mr. Henry wasn't defending anyone. He wasn't accusing anyone either. He spoke about football seasons that stole evenings, about bills no one noticed Kristen quietly handled, about conversations delayed because tomorrow always seemed more convenient, about kindness that slowly replaced honesty, about loneliness that hid inside ordinary routines. Then he looked around the room. Most people think betrayal begins with one terrible choice. He gently shook his head. Sometimes it begins with thousands of conversations that never happen. Nobody interrupted him. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, the story they'd repeated for years no longer sounded complete. Mr. Henry rested both hands on the microphone. "I've heard people spend years trying to decide who the villain was." He smiled sadly. "I don't believe there was one." The room stayed silent. Kristen believed working harder would protect her marriage. Kristen looked down at her folded hands. Mike looked for emotional understanding somewhere outside his marriage before exhausting every chance to rebuild it inside. Mike closed his eyes briefly, and Lauren failed to recognize that compassion can become emotional intimacy if boundaries aren't protected. Lauren nodded once. There was no argument in her face, only acceptance. Mr. Henry looked around the room one final time. The greatest betrayal wasn't simply that one relationship ended, and another began. He let the word settle. It was that three good people slowly stopped protecting the relationships that mattered most because they believed there would always be another season, another weekend, another conversation. He handed the microphone back without another word. No applause followed. No one knew whether applause belonged there. Guests, who had once spoken with certainty, now stared quietly at their tables. Some looked toward Kristen, others toward Mike and Lauren, not with judgment, with a kind of uncomfortable understanding, because the story hadn't changed. Only their understanding of it had. And somehow, that made every choice each of them had made feel heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. The reception never quite returned to what it had been before Mr. Henry's toast. People still ate. The music started again. Conversations resumed, but they sounded different, as though everyone had become more careful with their certainty. Kristen stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The evening air carried the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. She stood alone on the patio until she heard the door open behind her. Mike, he stopped several feet away. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk." Kristen looked toward the parking lot before answering. "I wasn't sure either." Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Finally, Mike said, "I've replayed that conversation at the kitchen table more times than I can count." She gave a small nod. "So have I." I kept thinking there had to be one moment I could point to. "There wasn't," Kristen replied. "That's what made it so hard." Mike looked down. "I'm sorry." She studied him for a moment, not searching for the man she married, simply seeing the man standing in front of her. "I know you are. I should have talked to you. I should have stopped pretending that doing more was the same as saying more." He smiled sadly. We were both waiting for the other person to notice, and neither of us asked. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to defend, no score to settle, no marriage to save, only the truth. Mike extended his hand. "Thank you. For the years we did have." Kristen looked at it, then shook it. "You gave me good years too." When they let go, neither felt the need to look back. A few minutes later, Lauren quietly approached Kristen. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I'm not here to ask for it." Kristen folded her arms, listening. "I should have stepped back sooner." "You tried," Kristen answered softly. "Sometimes. Not enough." Lauren's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I loved you as my friend. I never wanted to become part of your pain." "I believe you." The words surprised them both. Kristen wasn't excusing what had happened. She was refusing to carry it forever. "I don't know if we'll ever be friends again," she admitted. Lauren nodded. "I don't know either. But I'm tired of hating people who are already carrying enough." Neither woman hugged. Some endings don't need dramatic gestures. They simply need honesty. By the time dessert was served, the wedding had become something no one expected. Not scandalous, not ruined, simply more honest. Guests spoke less about blame and more about the small moments they had overlooked in their own lives. Several couples left the reception holding hands a little tighter than they had when they arrived. Mike and Lauren shared their first dance. It wasn't carefree. It was thoughtful. Each of them understood that love had brought them together, but love alone wouldn't keep them there. Later that evening, Mike leaned close and said, "If something ever feels wrong between us." Lauren finished the sentence. "We talk, no matter how uncomfortable." She nodded. No more waiting for the perfect time. Across the room, Kristen gathered her purse. A few guests stopped to speak with her, not out of pity, out of respect. She thanked them politely and stepped outside. As she walked toward her car, she realized something had changed. People no longer looked at her as the woman Mike had left. They looked at her as Kristen, the artist, the teacher, the woman who had built something meaningful from heartbreak. She smiled to herself before starting the engine. For years, she'd believed the end of her marriage had defined her. Tonight proved it hadn't. Back inside, the celebration continued. Not because everyone had forgotten the past, because they finally understood it wasn't as simple as they'd once believed. Months passed. Spring settled over Maple Ridge, bringing children back to the Community Arts Center in numbers Kristen never imagined. Paint covered tiny hands. Parents volunteered on weekends. Retired artists taught classes they once believed they'd never teach again. The old building was full almost every afternoon. One day, Kristen paused outside a classroom where a young girl was helping another child mix colors. She smiled. That was the dream she'd packed away all those years ago. It had waited for her anyway. Across town, Mike was still coaching. The wins mattered. So did the losses. But he had changed. When assistant coaches knocked on his office door wanting to talk, he closed his laptop. When players said something felt wrong at home, he listened before offering advice. He had learned that silence could solve a football game. It rarely solved a relationship. Lauren quietly became one of the center's regular volunteers. She never made speeches about redemption. She simply showed up. Week after week, parents noticed. Children adored her. Trust wasn't rebuilt through explanations. It grew through consistency. One afternoon, Mr. Henry visited the art center. He wandered slowly through the halls until he stopped outside Kristen's classroom. Children laughed as they proudly held up paintings that looked nothing alike. He watched for several minutes before Kristen joined him. "They're messy," she said with a smile. "They're honest," he replied. They stood together without speaking. Finally, Mr. Henry looked around the room and said, "Most people spend their lives waiting for one dramatic moment that changes everything." Kristen glanced toward the children. "And they're wrong?" "They usually are." He smiled. "It's the ordinary moments people stop paying attention to that change everything." Kristen looked through the classroom window once more. This time, she understood exactly what he meant. Maple Ridge eventually stopped talking about who had betrayed whom. People remembered something else instead. That marriages rarely fall apart because of one terrible day. Friendships rarely break because of one conversation. Lives are usually shaped by ordinary moments that seem too small to matter, until one day they become impossible to ignore. And maybe that was the quiet lesson everyone carried away from that wedding. Don't wait for a better season to tell the people you love what they're worth, because silence has a way of writing stories that honest conversations never have to.